Hello and welcome. The last few decades in Africa has been a story of political and economic transformation, where one step forward often translates to several steps backwards. As it stands, the reality of instability and widening inequality continues to act as a wake-up call for African leaders who care to listen. This is Africa This Week, and I'm your guide, Fadeshala Shotingwa. We start off the day with earlier in the week. Welcome on board. It was on the news on Monday that Gabon's president, Ali Bongo, was hospitalized last week in Saudi Arabia after suffering a stroke, while Gabonese authorities said he was admitted only because of fatigue. Bongo was still under observation at the King Faisal Hospital in Riyadh, where he was taken when medical and a diplomatic source both told journalists that the president suffered a stroke. Government spokesman Ike Unguoni denied claim and said that Bongo had severe fatigue after months of strenuous work. The president was in Saudi Arabia to attend the Future Investment Initiative Conference, where he was scheduled to speak alongside other African leaders. Bongo, whose family has ruled the Central African oil-producing country for nearly a half-century, has been president since succeeding his father, Omar, in 2009. Still on Monday, a 30-year-old woman blew herself up in the center of the Tunisian capital of Tunis, wounding 9 people, including 8 police, in what the Interior Ministry called a terrorist explosion. Witnesses described the blast on the central Habib Bourguiba Avenue, where hundreds of people later cordoned off the area near the capital's landmark municipal theater and the French embassy. Video posted on social media showed people gathering in the street and security personnel standing near the cordon tape. Tunisia, which is heavily dependent tourism, has improved security since a series of militant attacks targeting tourists caused the near collapse of the sector 3 years ago in 2015. 21 people were killed during a hostage siege in its national museum, the Bardo, in Tunis, and a gunman killed 38 people on a resort beach. There have been no attacks on that scale since then, but the economy has remained troubled, and the authorities worry about the militants who shelter in neighboring Libya. French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday also praised Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's raft of reforms that turned the region's politics on its head. The Ethiopian leaders' meeting with Macron was the first stop on his first official visit to Europe since taking office in April. Macron vowed to back Abiy on his regional peace efforts and moves to strengthen the economy. The two leaders discussed investment plans in cultural cooperation, urban development, and Ethiopian air transport development strategy, as well as signing 3 joint declarations.
Nous serons à vos côtés pour accompagner les efforts d'ouverture politique.
We will be at your side in your efforts to open policies, unification of the country, calming domestic tensions. We will be by your side in your efforts of economic transformation and liberalization. We will be there for the regional pacification you are leading. Finally, before concluding, I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to Mrs. Saleh Work Zewde, who was just elected President of Ethiopia at the end of last week. Mrs. Zewde is the country's first female president, and that is a strong symbolic gesture.
Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was welcomed by German Chancellor Angela Merkel on Tuesday to hold bilateral talks in order to strengthen ties between the two countries. Al-Sisi and Merkel discussed cooperation, international and regional issues of common interest, terrorism and illegal immigration. The meeting happened as Merkel hosted the G20 Compact, with Africa, the CWA conference intended to promote private investment in Africa. South Sudan rebel leader Riek Machar returned to the capital Juba on Wednesday to celebrate a peace deal more than 2 years after fierce fighting erupted in the city and forced him to flee the country. Machar flew in with his wife and a small retinue, but none of his troops then met his longtime rival, President Salva Kiir, and a lineup of regional leaders who had spent years pressing the two men to end their civil war. The world's youngest nation plunged into conflict in 2013 after Kiir sacked Machar as vice president. Machar fled to neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo in 2016 after fighting broke out again in the capital, wrecking an earlier peace deal and killing hundreds. He later traveled to South Africa, where he was held under house arrest until earlier this year. Under pressure from governments in East Africa, the United Nations and Western donors, Machar's group, other rebel factions and the government last month signed a peace deal under which he will again become vice president. Britain's Prince Charles congratulated Gambia on Thursday for turning its back on autocratic rule at home and returning to the Commonwealth fold. Speaking at a welcome ceremony in Banjul as he began a 9-day African tour, Prince Charles heralded the move as an important milestone for Gambia. The West African former British colony rejoined the Commonwealth in February, 5 years after its now exiled authoritarian former leader Yahya Jammeh pulled Gambia out, dubbing the 54-member group a new colonial institution. Jammeh, who fled Gambia last year after regional military launched an operation to remove him, repeatedly clashed with the British authorities over criticism of his government's human rights record. Critics of the Commonwealth see it as an outdated relic of Britain's imperial past, while advocates say it gives small countries like Gambia some relevance. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall are scheduled to visit Ghana on November the 2nd and Nigeria on November the 6th.
It was, if I may say so, an important milestone on the new road that the Gambia has chosen in turning your back on 22 years of autocratic rule in order to embrace a new beginning.
The recent decision by the Gambia to rejoin the Commonwealth is ample testimony of my government's readiness to enhance international cooperation. I also call on the United Kingdom, with whom we have special historical ties, to continue to support us through enhanced trade, investment and wider economic cooperation. We can only expect that after a long spell of misrule and dictatorship, we overcome the Gambia's isolation from the international community.
And South Sudan freed 2 associates of rebel leader Riek Machar from prison on Friday, advancing a deal to end almost 5 years of civil war. And to reinforce the accord signed in September, the South Sudanese President Salva Kiir on Wednesday ordered the release of retired South African Colonel William Adeniyi, an advisor to Machar, and James Govt, Machar's spokesman. And after signing paperwork confirming their release by the Interior Minister Michael Chiengek, Adeniyi and Govt were brought out of their cell and left prison in Juba in civilian clothes. Adeniyi was sentenced to death in February for trying to bring down the government, while Govt was sentenced to death in the same month on charges of treason and incitement against the government.
The country needs to move forward. And as I said, the way the President spoke the other day, with the support of Dr. Riek and the other parties, and the support of everybody around here today, that is the future, not for us, but for the next generation and the generations after them.
I want to thank His Excellency the President, General Salva Kiir, for ordering my release. I'm very happy that this will enable me to reunite with my family members and my friends after a long period of time.
And with that, we have come to the end of Earlier in the Week. Up next is Digging Deep, and that will be after the break. Just stay with us. Welcome back to Africa This Week. From the historical struggle of the working class to the present-day effect of capitalism, key moments have grown into strong movements as the forces of labor often have to contend with the ideals of minimum wage and the idea of maximum inequality. No wonder the average worker in Africa believes the odds of survival are far from being stocked in his or her favor, with sustainable demands and inadequate supply stuck in a revolving door. Now, joining me to dig deep on Africa This Week is Adeniyi Kunnu, researcher and public affairs analyst. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Good to always have you.
Yes, thank you.
Well, what are your thoughts on the issues on labor and the government?
All right, let's begin with figures, because our life, as I've always said, is about figures. If we compare the 5 nominal GDPs of African countries, beginning with Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, and Angola, Nigeria's nominal GDP stands at $376 billion, followed by that of South Africa at $349 billion. That of Egypt is $237 billion. Algeria is 4th in terms of nominal GDP at $178 billion. And Angola comes 5th on the African continent with $124 billion. If I took it away from there and I come to the minimum wage of these African countries, except of course for Algeria that doesn't have captured its minimum wage, I'll begin with South Africa, the country that is second to Nigeria in terms of its minimum wage. South Africa's minimum wage is $206 in a month. That is the minimum wage. If I went to Egypt, it's $174 in a month. If I came to Algeria, that is $179 a month. Now, let me go further by giving us the Naira equivalent of what we earn. At the moment, Nigeria's minimum wage is actually $50, less than 100. Indeed. Yet Nigeria has the highest nominal GDP of these 5 countries.
Indeed.
It is a gross anomaly.
Well, with all these figures, we've reeled them out the entire week. We've had several programs reeling out these figures.
Yes, please.
The point now is the governments, the state governors have agreed to a figure of 22,500 Naira, while Labour insists they will not go on. How do we now explain this dynamic?
Well, if we refer to the Income and Wages Commission, that has overseen the increment of the allowances and what goes to the bank accounts of many political office holders, perhaps we need to call them and bring them into the picture. That why has there been, between 1999 and now, some kind of astronomical increase in what goes in for the lawmakers? When you earn 13.5 a month as running cost and maybe about 750,000 are not accounted for, and you work for half of the year or maybe 2/3 of the year, then it calls to question equality. And anytime we talk about government, it's about proper representation of the people. So when people who appropriately should be the ones representing properly fall on the side of the kind of despicable advantage that they have, then I tell you it is annoying. And that is why Labour has insisted that people's lives are worth it. But again, let us check the conditions for increment. The increments that Labour has been clamoring for has long been due 3 years ago. It rounded off 2015, so
Indeed.
expectedly it would have been effective 2016. And I remember that about a year ago or more, the minister talked about the meeting, of course, that has the tripartite committee sat, from which they arrived at this figure. As a matter of fact, the Labour minister said the first quarter of this year that by September it should be in effect. People can double check what I have said here in your studio. These are facts. You know, it even becomes more painful, that at some point when this 30,000 was agreed, it was the figure given according to what Labour communicated to some of us.
Indeed.
That the government had agreed. So a situation where you agreed at some point And at another point, you actually turned around.
You turn around
it's
and
something
say
shocking
it's
to me.
22,500, and that's a meager, less than 5,000 naira increase from the previous 18,000.
Most definitely.
Now the point is, no one is agreeing. Labour is definitely not agreeing to this 22,500 naira, and there is an impending strike. What do you think we should always insist on strikes? Where does it lead us at the end of the day? I mean, there was a strike before government met with Labour and agreed to negotiate again, and then they came up with this figure. So can we keep revolving round a strike?
Not at all. Power has its own hold on people. And if you check the history of sovereign democracies across the world, or the balkanization of entities, it has always been by struggle. Ditto requesting what is your right. You see, what normally results in the problems or the cracks we have is when labor or constituted authorities refuse to understand that regardless of maybe existing circumstances, you have to obey the rule books.
Yeah.
And if you cannot perform, it is honorable you resign, or you actually endeavor to seek the understanding of the people that you actually owe their allegiance. And that is what government has failed to do in this part. Government must come to terms with the fact that it is not doing labor or Nigerian workers any favor. It is their right, because the act that actually constituted this body says 5 years it must be reviewed. So when people earn just about maybe 600 naira a day, that means if you work from on the island and you live on the mainland, that means what your life is worth every day is 600 naira. So if they increase it to 22,500, that means your life is worth 750 naira a day. Leaving your home at 5 a.m. and coming by maybe 7 p.m. every day. We really need to have things work for those who indeed grind it out to make the economy of the country worth the while. And do not forget also that if government fails to implement this particular one, it is the same parameter that the private organizations will begin to measure out, even if some differ. So it's important for government to show example, ensure that this particular agreement is fulfilled, and do the best it could so that we don't come back to go on strike. But the strike, as it seems, has become inevitable. Inevitable.
There's a court order restraining the strike from holding.
Up until yesterday, let's say at the beginning of the legal year, the Chief Justice of Nigeria mentioned that judges must stop granting ex parte motion.
Right.
So that simply means if the Chief Justice of this country has instructed, so I'm wondering how indeed the industrial court was able to give an ex parte motion in a matter. And if you look at it, the indiscretion of government happens over 2 weeks ago when it issued a white paper criminalizing the fact that people can go on strike. And let me give you this picture, because the world is watching. Africa is watching us. When government released the white paper, it gave certain conditions. And I want to go straight to that which concerns labor. It says if, for instance, an employer is locked out of his organization, the days that the employer comes there must be paid by the person that employed the person. If an employee rather is locked out, the employer must pay the person. Then they now say anytime workers go on strike, they will not get paid. But government is not telling us what do workers do to government if people work and they have not paid. Over 23 states are still owing. So what do you expect those who have worked to do to government if you find it very comfortable issuing white paper, criminalizing people going on strike when you have not fulfilled your side of the bargain?
In any case, Labour says whether or not there's a court order restraining them, they're going to still...
They've not seen it. They mentioned up until yesterday around 10 p.m., I had some communication.
Oh, I got information from a Labour correspondent who says that Labour has heard of it, and they're like, in spite of that court order, they're still going to, they're still going to go ahead with the strike. But let me ask you, some school of thought have argued that minimum wage anyway, the increase of it has never really done anything much, because as soon as the government increases the minimum wage, then price of commodities in the market skyrockets.
It is simply a result of poor fiscal administration over the years.
Okay.
A situation where government earns in excess of several trillions, maybe every year, but of that monies, it is actually administered into projects that will not generate any revenue. That will in turn be something that goes into the coffers of government. You see, more or less like the way we manage our personal finance. You can't have 16 children on a salary of 60,000 naira a month. There's going to be an imbalance. So that simply means when people have a certain amount of money, for instance, during the last administration we're here, that the crude sold for well over 100. The budget of this year, let me say this again, so that people will take note in their scrapbooks.
Indeed.
The budget of this year was actually premised or more or less pegged at less than $50 a barrel. The crude has been consistent at 70.75 for the past month. What happens to the excess amount?
Over that.
Now, if, for instance, people are not smart enough to ask that question, I'll put it to them, ask your government, the excess $25, where has it been kept since crude has been selling consistently at $70 per barrel or $75 a barrel over time? Now, these are the issues that when you don't factor in, people suffer. And do not also forget that even getting to pass the budget for the election was a problem, but in fact, it is a cumulative impropriety of our fiscal policies, especially as it concerns finance, that has kept us at this point. So even if it is increased, over time, because government, which of course is in continuum, has not been able to direct little or approach little things properly, then it becomes too much a problem for it to handle. So these are critical issues.
Indeed they are. Well, Labour says that the Governors' Forum unilaterally pegged the minimum wage at $22,000 and that before you arrive at a minimum wage, you're supposed to have a negotiation. You know, there's supposed to be an agreement. What's your thought on that?
In the first place, I have checked the GROM of the country and other legal documents. The Nigeria Governors' Forum is an aberration in existence. If at all it wants to exist, I think it's communication to the press. And I think this is also instructive for the press. If you want to address the governors, you say Nigerian governors. When you say Nigerian Governors Forum, it is beginning to assume a power that perhaps it has arrogated to itself, such that one begins to feel it can make authorities or actually decide on the future of Nigeria. It is completely wrong. So if you want to communicate with anybody, as a group of governors,
they do exist. They just don't exist as the,
the point is,
body to negotiate.
The point remains that it is the crux of the point here. You cannot issue a statement that you have arrived
at a figure.
That is where Labour in itself continues to get angry. You cannot tell us that as a body that is not recognized by law, you have decided upon what you want to give your people. Ordinarily, what I know from findings is if there's an amount agreed, and the governors perhaps are having certain challenges in meeting up to that, they're supposed to go to their respective states and communicate the position individually to the workers in their state, then come back with some kind of communication from which one resorts to what is agreeable for both sides or those persons that have constituted the committee that sat and discussed this issue. But a situation where you begin to do this, then it will definitely engender strife, which of course it is doing.
There was a report by the tripartite committee. Why isn't that report being effected?
If we did a careful examination of what the Labour minister said last year, at the first quarter of this year, and this position, it's just because there's a deliberate or a genomic disorder of dishonesty. And that really is the reason. Because if you see yourself as somebody who was in office or who is in office because the people gave you the mandate, you must respect them enough and be honorable enough to fulfill what you have said. So I think it is because of the deliberate dishonesty of maybe the Labour Ministry and some other persons who actually sat at the meeting and decided to go another way. So it's very obvious. Things
are coming to a head unless, of course, government and Labour are able to reach an agreement.
I doubt if that's
midnight.
I doubt.
Monday night.
I doubt if it's going to happen.
Adeniyi Kunnu, researcher and public affairs analyst, would like to thank you for joining me on Africa This Week.
Yes, thank you
for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Well, often regarded as government of the people, for the people and by the people, democracy in Africa looks more like glass half empty, with governance reduced to a contest for power to rule rather than an opportunity to lead. Perhaps another missed opportunity for change and hope to the majority of young Nigerians who have not seen any other leader. And so the watchdog says that Africa, under any other rulership, and also considering the fact that this minimum wage issue needs to come to a head. That's our program for today, and I have been your guide, Fadishola Shotingwa. Many thanks for watching, and bye for now.